The story begins with Mark Henderson, a man enjoying the simple pleasures of suburban life on a hot Saturday afternoon. He is lounging in his inflatable pool, affectionately called the Lagoon of Leisure. This scene immediately establishes Mark as a relatable, laid-back character who seeks peace and relaxation in his private backyard. His choice of activities, bobbing in his pool, pretending to be a manatee, is a light-hearted, whimsical touch, symbolizing his desire to escape the mundane pressures of life and embrace comfort in his own space. His experience, however, is interrupted by the arrival of his neighbor, HOA, Agnes Plumtree, the epitome of suburban entitlement. HOA is introduced as the resident busybody, someone whose presence is akin to an unwelcome disturbance in Mark's otherwise tranquil weekend. The narrative establishes her as a character whose disapproval looms large, evident from her helmet of perfectly coiffed gray hair and a face set in that familiar expression of perpetual disapproval. This description paints HOA as a hypercritical figure, whose judgment seems to permeate every aspect of her interactions with others. In this context, HOA represents a stereotypical Karen figure, someone who demands control over situations that are none of her business, often without regard for others' rights or boundaries. When HOA approaches Mark in the pool, the interaction starts off with her critical tone. She immediately labels Mark's pool, something that brings him comfort, as an eyesore. This phrase is significant because it immediately establishes HOA's belief that her subjective opinion on aesthetics holds more weight than Mark's enjoyment of his own property. She does not see Mark's pool as a source of leisure or personal enjoyment but as a problem to be fixed, imposing her values over his. Her comment about how the pool lowers property values is another key insight into her mindset. It reveals HOA's fixation on maintaining the external appearances of the neighborhood to the point of disregarding personal freedoms and well-being. She sees the neighborhood as an environment to uphold her status and image, rather than a place for neighbors to live freely. Mark's response is key here. He resists the urge to be confrontational and instead uses charm to diffuse the situation. He gently responds to HOA with, "It's keeping me cool, Agnes, and it's my property." His attempt to remain calm and maintain control of the conversation, despite HOA's intrusive and hostile approach, shows his understanding that escalation is not the solution. Yet, his calmness and measured response are met with further demands. HOA insists that she needs it, further emphasizing her sense of entitlement. The fact that she expects Mark to part with something that brings him personal joy, especially for the sake of her grandchild, speaks to her belief that the wants of others should always be secondary to her own desires. The mention of HOA's grandson, Bartholomew, provides an additional layer to the conflict. Mark's knowledge of Bartholomew's disruptive behavior, a tiny terror, who once smeared peanut butter on Mark's car, further solidifies Mark's stance in refusing to let the boy near his pool. The child's misbehavior is a reasonable concern, but HOA ignores Mark's position, instead framing her request as an almost righteous entitlement. Mark's continued refusal marks the beginning of his firm stand against HOA's unreasonable demands, and he expresses this clearly, setting the stage for the ensuing conflict. In this first part, the tension between personal freedom and entitlement is established. Mark's attempt to protect his property is met with HOA's sense of self-entitlement and her deeply ingrained need for control over others. The humor in the scene, especially with Mark's lightheartedness about the pool and his refusal to engage with HOA's demands, contrasts sharply with her increasingly absurd requests. This sets up the escalating tension, making it clear that the situation will only continue to spiral as HOA's demands become more outrageous. As the tension between Mark and HOA, Agnes Plumtree, continued to build, Mark found himself growing increasingly frustrated with her persistence. After rejecting her initial offer to buy his beloved Lagoon of Leisure, he had hoped the situation would end there. But Agnes, it seemed, was not one to back down easily. Within moments of his refusal, she ramped up her demands, insisting that not only should he sell her the pool, but that he should also hand it over willingly, for the good of her grandson, Bartholomew. Mark's frustration turned to disbelief as Agnes persisted. The more she spoke, the more it became clear that her sense of entitlement was not just limited to aesthetics and property values, it had ballooned into a full-on invasion of Mark's personal space and privacy. Her demand for the pool was so ridiculous that Mark initially thought it was some sort of joke, but the steely determination in her eyes told him otherwise. She was serious. With his patience thinning, Mark tried to maintain his composure. "Agnes, I told you, I'm not selling my pool," he said firmly. His voice remained calm, but it was clear he wasn't about to budge. "I've got every right to enjoy my property however I see fit." He couldn't help but wonder, however, what had possessed her to think that she could simply demand something from him with no regard for his feelings or his rights. Agnes, however, was relentless. "You don't get it, do you, Reginald?" she shot back. "I'm an upstanding member of this community. My taxes pay for the roads you drive on. You should be grateful that I'm giving you the opportunity to help out a senior citizen like me." Her words were drenched in a patronizing tone that made Mark bristle. She wasn't just demanding the pool for herself, she was trying to guilt him into giving it to her, as if her age and tax contributions somehow gave her a pass to take whatever she wanted. Mark fought the urge to argue further, but he could feel his resolve starting to waver. He understood that this wasn't just about the pool anymore, it was about standing up to someone who believed they had a right to control the lives of others. Agnes's blatant sense of entitlement was on full display, and Mark realized that if he gave in now, it would only set a precedent for more of this behavior in the future. He knew there was no reasoning with her. As Agnes grew increasingly insistent, her face reddening with frustration, Mark decided to take a different approach. "Look, Agnes," he said, trying to remain calm, "I'm happy to help out when I can, but not like this. This is my pool, and I'm going to keep it." The moment the words left his mouth, Agnes's face twisted with fury. It was clear that she was not used to being told no, and her reaction only confirmed Mark's suspicion that this was a woman accustomed to getting her way. "This is unacceptable. You are denying a child joy. You're being selfish and inconsiderate," she shrieked, the volume of her voice rising with every word. Mark, exhausted from the back and forth, knew the conversation was quickly heading toward a breaking point. "I'm sorry, but my answer is no. And frankly, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave me to enjoy my Saturday in peace," he said, hoping that this would be the end of it. But instead of walking away, Agnes pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling with indignation. "I'm calling the authorities," she declared, her voice dripping with faux authority. Mark froze in disbelief. "The authorities? For a pool?" he muttered, but it was too late. Agnes was already dialing 911. Mark shook his head in disbelief as he watched her bark into the phone, her words growing increasingly absurd. "I'm being harassed. This man is refusing to cooperate. He's creating a disturbance." Her dramatic outburst left Mark stunned. This wasn't just a petty dispute anymore, this was an all-out assault on his rights and privacy. And somehow, the woman who had caused the trouble was trying to turn herself into the victim. Feeling utterly defeated, Mark stepped out of his pool, dripping wet, and began walking back toward his house. "I'm going inside," he muttered, still in shock at how far this had escalated. He had hoped that a simple refusal would have been enough, but he was quickly learning that with HOA, nothing was ever simple. It seemed like things were about to get even more ridiculous. The police arrived exactly 15 minutes later, their squad car pulling up to the curb with sirens off but lights flashing. Mark stood in his driveway, a towel draped around his shoulders, his mind racing. He couldn't believe this was happening. Over an inflatable pool. The situation had escalated beyond reason, and yet here they were, on his property, because of Agnes's decision to call the authorities over a personal disagreement. The officers who emerged from the patrol car seemed equally baffled by the scene. One was a young woman, Officer Davis, and the other was a grizzled veteran, Officer Miller. Mark could tell by Officer Davis's slightly bewildered expression that she was new to handling this kind of ridiculousness. Meanwhile, Officer Miller, with his hardened expression and weary demeanor, looked as though he had seen far too many bizarre situations to be shocked anymore. Agnes wasted no time in launching into her dramatic narrative. She marched toward the officers, her eyes still glowing with righteous fury, and began her tirade. "He's depriving my grandson of a summer experience," she wailed. "He's refusing to be a good neighbor. This man is a menace to society, just look at him lounging around in that thing." She pointed at the inflatable pool, as if it were a symbol of the greatest injustice in the neighborhood. Mark was dumbfounded. "Are you serious?" he muttered under his breath. He tried to remain calm as he greeted the officers, briefly explaining the absurdity of the situation. "She wants my pool," he said. "I said no, and now she's called the cops." Officer Miller glanced over at Agnes, who was still ranting on about how Mark was a threat to the neighborhood's peace. Officer Davis seemed to be trying to hold back laughter, her face flushed with the effort. "You've heard the story," Officer Miller said to Mark, clearly wanting to get to the heart of the matter. "Let's hear your side." Mark explained the situation calmly, emphasizing how unreasonable and invasive Agnes's demands had been. He mentioned her history of meddling in the neighborhood and how this had been the final straw. Officer Miller listened attentively, occasionally looking at Agnes, who had now started pacing back and forth, muttering angrily under her breath about how Mark was entitled and selfish. When Mark finished, Officer Miller nodded thoughtfully. "Okay, I think I got it," he said, turning to Officer Davis. "Davis, why don't you check the regulations on inflatable pools for this area?" Officer Davis, trying to hold in her laughter, excused herself and walked to the patrol car to look up the local regulations. Mark could only shake his head, wondering if this whole situation was some sort of bizarre dream. When Officer Davis returned, her face was still flushed with suppressed amusement. She reported, "Everything checks out, Officer Miller. No warrants for the lagoon." At that moment, Mark's confusion reached a new peak. Officer Miller turned to Agnes, who was now waiting with a smug smile, expecting to win the argument. The veteran officer cleared his throat and, to Mark's horror, began siding with her. "We have assessed the situation, and we have to agree with you," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. Mark's jaw dropped. "Excuse me," he stammered. Mark stared at Officer Miller, convinced he had misheard the officer's words. He blinked, trying to process what had just been said. "You agree with her?" Mark asked, unable to hide his disbelief. "You're siding with her, after everything she's done?" Officer Miller held up a hand to silence him. "Now, hold on," he said, raising his eyebrows. "We've been looking at the situation. And it's clear that your pool doesn't meet the community standards." Mark opened his mouth to protest, but Officer Miller continued, "Specifically, the regulations for pools in this area are very clear." He looked down at his notepad and read aloud, Section 42B, subsection 7, paragraph delta clearly states that all pools must be adequately sized and of sufficient depth to maintain aquatic safety standards. Mark's eyes widened as he tried to make sense of what the officer was saying. "What does that even mean?" he asked, his voice shaky with disbelief. "It means," Officer Miller said, looking directly at Mark, "that your inflatable pool doesn't meet the requirements. It's not deep enough for a proper swim. It lacks proper filtration, and frankly, it's a drowning hazard waiting to happen." Mark's mind was spinning. "It's an inflatable pool. I'm just trying to cool off," he said, his voice rising in frustration. "I'm a perfectly capable swimmer. This is ridiculous." But Officer Miller was unfazed. "It doesn't matter," he said, shaking his head. "Regulations are regulations. We have to order you to dismantle and remove this aquatic contraption for the safety of the community." Agnes, who had been watching with rapt attention, clapped her hands together in delight. "Oh, thank you, officers. You're upholding the law. You're saving lives," she exclaimed, practically vibrating with glee. Mark stood frozen, his brain still struggling to process the absurdity of the situation. This was real. Officer Miller and Agnes were actually getting away with this. His beloved pool was being taken away because of some obscure, arbitrary regulation that made no sense for an inflatable pool. Just when Mark thought things couldn't get worse, Officer Davis returned from the patrol car, still holding back laughter. "Everything checks out," she said, her voice strained with suppressed amusement. "No outstanding warrants for the lagoon." Mark couldn't believe it. Not only was Agnes getting away with her demand, but now the police were actually siding with her. He felt his frustration boiling over. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice cracking with disbelief. "You're going to make me take down my pool because of some regulation about swimming pools?" Officer Miller shrugged, his face still calm. "Sorry, son. We're just doing our job. You have 24 hours to remove the pool. Otherwise, we'll have to issue a citation." He paused, looking at Mark with a knowing glint in his eye. "And trust me, those fines aren't something you want to deal with." Mark's face flushed with rage, but before he could say anything more, Agnes chimed in with a smirk. "Perhaps, Reginald, you could donate the pool to a more deserving cause, like Bartholomew." She was practically glowing with victory. Mark's clenched fists tightened. "Over my dead body," he muttered, his teeth gritted. Officer Miller sighed. "All right, ma'am. Let's not push it. Just focus on getting the pool removed. And if you'll excuse us, we've got other pool-related emergencies to attend to." As the officers walked back to their patrol car, Mark watched them go in disbelief. Agnes stood behind him, still smiling smugly. "Well, Reginald," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "looks like justice has been served. Perhaps this will teach you a lesson about being a good neighbor." Mark just stared at her, his mind still racing. He wanted to scream, to call her every name in the book, but he was too stunned to do anything. He watched as she strutted back to her house, a triumphant spring in her step. For a moment, Mark considered refusing to follow the police order, but the thought of fines and more hassle quickly squashed any rebellious. The following day, Mark found himself standing in his backyard, staring at the sad, crumpled heap of plastic that had once been his beloved lagoon of leisure. The pool, a symbol of his hard-earned leisure and personal space, now lay deflated, an unwanted relic of a confrontation that had spiraled far beyond reason. Agnes, as always, had gotten her way, and Mark was left to clean up the mess. Both literally and figuratively. He had never expected his weekend of relaxation to turn into a bureaucratic nightmare, but here he was, trying to figure out how to move on from what had transpired. He had spent hours deflating the pool, carefully folding it back into its original box, knowing full well that Agnes would be watching from her window, eager to see him comply. It was humiliating, frustrating, and utterly ridiculous. Mark took a deep breath as he stood over the now deflated pool. He knew he had no choice but to follow the officer's orders. The threat of fines had been too real for him to ignore. He had never been one to rock the boat unnecessarily, but this situation was different. Agnes's sense of entitlement had crossed a line that Mark couldn't easily forget. The frustration gnawed at him as he folded the plastic into the box, taping it shut, knowing that Agnes was about to claim victory in a battle that shouldn't have even happened. As the sun began to set, Mark glanced at the box one more time. He felt a surge of anger and an overwhelming urge to do something, anything, to take back some control in this ludicrous situation. He wasn't about to let Agnes win without some kind of rebellion. That's when the idea hit him. It was petty, sure, but it felt like the only small act of defiance he could manage. Mark knew exactly what he had to do. He waited until nightfall, when the full moon cast an eerie glow over the neighborhood. The streets were quiet, the neighborhood asleep, or so it seemed. Mark quietly grabbed the deflated pool from his yard and dragged it to the curb in front of Agnes's house. He paused for a moment, taking in the absurdity of the situation. He could already imagine the look of shock on her face when she discovered that the pool she had fought so hard to claim was now a sad, flat piece of plastic. With a smirk, Mark took out a can of bright pink spray paint and, with bold strokes, wrote the word "free" on the box. It was a small but satisfying act of rebellion, and it gave him a sense of justice in a situation where he had felt helpless. Mark didn't stick around to see what would happen next. He returned to his house, feeling oddly satisfied with his petty act of vengeance. He knew that this wasn't going to solve anything in the grand scheme of things, but it felt good to get the last laugh. The next morning, Mark woke up to the sounds of the neighborhood bustling to life. As he sipped his coffee, he glanced out the window to see Bartholomew, Agnes's grandson, gleefully dragging the deflated pool into her yard. Mark couldn't help but smile as he watched the little boy's innocent joy at receiving the free pool, unaware of the irony behind it. It wasn't long before Agnes came outside, her eyes scanning the yard. Mark could practically hear her shriek of despair from across the street. The sight of her grandchild with the deflated pool was enough to send her into a frenzy, and Mark found himself grinning from ear to ear, even though he knew he was only delaying the inevitable. After the small act of rebellion, Mark's life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but he couldn't shake the feeling of satisfaction from his petty revenge. The next few days were uneventful, with the typical suburban rhythms of lawn care, occasional neighborly chats, and the daily grind of his work. But one evening, as Mark sat on his porch enjoying a cool breeze, his phone buzzed. It was a message from one of his other neighbors, Jane, who lived down the block. The message read, "Hey, just saw Agnes at the community center. She looked like she had a meltdown over something. Did you do something to her?" Mark chuckled to himself. Of course, Agnes was furious. After all, the pool had gone from her anticipated acquisition to a deflated, free piece of plastic right in front of her house. The audacity of it all seemed to irk her even more than Mark had expected. He didn't respond to Jane right away, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that his small act of defiance had become a source of entertainment for the neighborhood. A few days later, the buzz about the incident had escalated. Mark found himself in the midst of an unexpected neighborhood celebrity moment. Neighbors stopped by, congratulating him on his brilliant move. Some even offered to help him with small tasks, as if the deflation of the pool had somehow elevated him to a position of local power. While it was all in good fun, Mark couldn't help but feel slightly uncomfortable with all the attention. He had simply wanted to defend his right to enjoy his property, not become a hero for the neighborhood. One afternoon, Mark ran into Officer Davis, the young officer who had been part of the ridiculous pool-related emergency. She approached him with a sheepish smile. "Hey, Mark," she said, trying to suppress a grin. "I just wanted to apologize for how everything went down with Agnes." Mark raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "Well," she continued, her tone lowering to one of confidentiality, "I know it was all a bit of a mess, and honestly, I've heard a lot of chatter around here. Some of the neighbors are upset with how things were handled, and I just wanted to say that we've had a couple of complaints about Agnes's behavior." Mark was taken aback by this revelation. It seemed that Agnes's reputation was finally catching up to her. "Honestly, Mark," Officer Davis continued, "I think you've earned the neighborhood's respect with how you handled it. People were impressed by your patience." Mark didn't know how to respond. He had just been trying to live his life, and yet here he was, the subject of a neighborhood saga. The idea that his small, petty act of rebellion had somehow resonated with others was both amusing and unsettling. Mark could feel the shift in the air as the neighborhood's dynamics subtly changed. It wasn't just about the pool anymore, it was about people realizing that standing up for themselves, even in small ways, could lead to change. Mark hadn't intended to be the catalyst for such a shift, but now that he was, he couldn't deny the pride he felt. Agnes had made a spectacle of herself, and it was clear that, for once, the community was seeing through her act. As time passed, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that his life had somehow shifted. The small act of defiance had opened up an unexpected dialogue within the neighborhood. Agnes's behavior had drawn more attention than Mark had anticipated, and he found himself navigating the aftermath of the situation. What was meant to be a quiet, personal rebellion had turned into something much larger, something that had influenced the way the entire neighborhood viewed him. Mark received messages from neighbors he barely knew, many offering congratulations, some questioning why he hadn't handled things differently. The support was appreciated, but Mark knew that the situation with Agnes had been blown out of proportion. In the grand scheme of things, the pool wasn't worth all the drama it had caused. Yet, here he was, becoming somewhat of a local figure, someone who had stood up to an overzealous Karen in a small suburban town. Despite the chaos, Mark continued to carry on with his life, but it wasn't without reflection. He began to question the role of entitlement in his community. Had Agnes's behavior been so outrageous because of a deeper, more ingrained sense of privilege, or was it simply the product of a petty disagreement? As he spent more time thinking about it, he realized that it wasn't just about the pool. It was about the way people took ownership of their surroundings, their space, and their interactions with others. The neighborhood, for all its beauty and quiet charm, had become a microcosm of larger societal issues. Mark didn't want to dwell on these thoughts for too long. After all, he had his own battles to fight. Yet, the presence of people like Agnes, those who felt entitled to take what wasn't theirs, was something he couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Agnes's frustration had not gone unnoticed by others in the community. As the weeks went on, there were whispers. Some neighbors who had been previously intimidated by her now found themselves speaking out, no longer afraid to challenge her demands. Her influence in the neighborhood seemed to be waning, and it wasn't just because of Mark's deflation of the pool. It was because people had seen how her behavior had impacted others and they no longer tolerated it. Mark noticed this shift slowly, the undercurrent of change that had spread through Harrow Creek Estates. The sense of unity among neighbors began to grow. People started attending local meetings, discussing ways to make their community a better place, focusing on mutual respect and cooperation. Even those who hadn't spoken out against Agnes's previous antics now found themselves voicing their concerns. A few weeks after Mark had deflated the pool and Agnes had stormed off with her self-righteous attitude intact, Mark was finally able to catch a moment of quiet reflection. He had spent most of the time since the incident watching from his porch, keeping a low profile while still receiving the occasional congratulations from neighbors. His life had returned to normal, but the ripple effects of the debacle were still being felt across the community. Mark was enjoying a rare afternoon of peace when a familiar figure approached his front gate. It was Jane, the neighbor who had sent him the message a few days earlier about Agnes's meltdown. She had a wide grin on her face and a cup of coffee in hand, the steaming aroma wafting over to Mark as she leaned against the fence. "I've got some gossip for you," Jane said, her eyes twinkling with excitement. "So, I heard through the grapevine that Agnes has started trying to sell that damn pool on Facebook Marketplace. Can you believe it? She's trying to get rid of the thing she was so sure she was entitled to." Mark raised an eyebrow in disbelief. "She's seriously trying to sell it? After everything that happened?" Jane laughed. "Yep. It seems like she's giving it one last shot. But get this. She's listing it as gently used and claiming that it has great sentimental value." Jane shook her head in mock disbelief. "I have no idea what she's thinking, but the look on her face when she realized what you did, priceless." Mark chuckled, feeling a sense of satisfaction once again. Agnes might have been determined to have the last word, but Mark knew that the situation had changed in ways she hadn't expected. The neighborhood was now more united than it had ever been, and it was thanks, in part, to his simple refusal to sell an inflatable pool. Mark took a sip of his own coffee, letting the warmth of the brew soothe him. It had been a strange, unexpected journey, but he was starting to see that sometimes standing up for yourself, no matter how small the act, could make all the difference. As the days passed, Mark felt himself settling into a rhythm once more. His backyard was quiet again, free from the daily drama of Agnes's demands. His inflatable pool, long since deflated, was tucked away in the garage, and the drama of the previous weeks was slowly becoming a distant memory. But the undercurrents of change in Harrow Creek Estates were still palpable. People who had been too intimidated to speak out against Agnes's demanding and entitled behavior were now standing up for themselves. Neighbors who once avoided conflict were now coming together at local meetings, discussing ways to address the issues that had long been swept under the rug. Mark had become an unintentional symbol of resistance, though he never sought that role. The neighborhood's transformation wasn't immediate, but it was noticeable. Even those who had been neutral about the situation began to realize that standing up to injustice, no matter how small, was important. Conversations about fairness, respect, and community were now taking place in the streets and at the local coffee shop. People were sharing their frustrations, not just about Agnes, but about the way the neighborhood had allowed such behavior to fester for so long. Mark's involvement in the community had also deepened. Though he still wasn't the type to attend every meeting or get too involved in the gossip, he did start to feel a sense of pride in what was happening around him. The neighborhood was no longer the place it had been when he first moved in, one where people kept to themselves and avoided conflict. It was evolving, becoming a place where neighbors supported each other and spoke out when they saw something wrong. Months had passed since the pool debacle, and Mark found himself sitting on his porch one evening, reflecting on everything that had happened. The changes in Harrow Creek estates were subtle but significant. He had witnessed his neighborhood shift from one of passive indifference to one of active engagement. People who had once been afraid to speak up were now voicing their concerns, and it felt like the community was finally moving towards something better. Mark wasn't the type to bask in the glory of his actions. He hadn't wanted to become the town's hero, but in a way, that was exactly what he had become. It wasn't about the pool or Agnes anymore, it was about the fact that one simple, seemingly small act of resistance had sparked a change. Though the memory of Agnes's antics still made him chuckle, Mark knew that the true impact of his actions wasn't in the deflated pool or the ridiculous police call. It was in how the neighborhood had come together to challenge entitlement, to stand up for fairness, and to embrace community. Mark finished his coffee and leaned back in his chair, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. He felt content, knowing that while he hadn't set out to change anything, his simple act of standing up for himself had made a difference. The community was stronger for it, and that, in the end, was all that mattered.